The definition of leverage is using fixed costs in an attempt to magnify profits. We're going to look at three different forms of leverage. We'll start with operating leverage. Operating leverage basically looks at the asset side of the organization. It says, what fixed operating costs do we have rather than variable costs? What fixed costs do we have, or are we increasing in an attempt to magnify profits? This is a typical situation I had a few years ago with a client. They decided to replace some of their labor force with machines. So we're taking a variable cost, labor, replacing it with a fixed cost, machinery. They were increasing their operating leverage. They felt that by substituting fixed cost for variable, they could increase their consistency, they could increase their reliability, therefore they could take on more business. After paying for the increased fixed cost, they would increase their bottom line. And that's really what operating leverage does. Operating leverage measures the relative changes between sales, the top line on your income statement, and EBIT, or your net operating profit. And we'll go through a spreadsheet and calculate this in just a few minutes. But operating leverage is a choice. The higher the fixed cost on the asset side, the higher the operating leverage. As a business is growing, that frequently gives us an opportunity to increase our operating profit. Of course, the downside of operating leverage is if we don't reach the revenue targets that we need to, we still must pay for those fixed assets. Those fixed operating costs are still going to be there. Therefore, the higher the operating leverage, the higher the possibility of not making the profits we want. Just like the basic leverage we talked about on the previous slide, debt versus equity. The higher the debt, the higher the risk of default. And in the leverage, the higher our operating leverage, the higher the possibility of not making the operating profit we want. So a simple formula looking from period 1 to period 2 is if we calculate the percentage change in our operating profit. So if our operating profit in period 1 was 10%, and in period 2 it's 12%, percentage change is 2 out of the 10, which is 20%, divided by our percentage change in sales. What was the top line? Well, if sales went from 10,000 to 15,000, that's a 50% increase. Well, if we have 20% divided by 50%, that gives you your degree of operating leverage. And this is really what we're looking for. It's a way to measure the relative leverage of our organization. And it will predict, based on this, the amount of change that we'll have. So if sales increase by 20%, our degree of operating leverage is 4. Well, 20% times 4, we should see an 80% change, increase in our operating profit. But please remember, leverage is a two-edged sword. Although it will magnify our gains when we calculate it correctly, it also will magnify our losses. So if our degree of operating leverage is 4 and we have an increase in sales, we can take that percentage increase in sales times 4, and that will predict the percentage change in operating profit. However, if we have a decrease in operating leverage, if we have a decrease in sales by 4% times our operating leverage of 4, we can predict a decrease in our operating profit, our EBIT, of 16%. So that's one of the most important points in discussing leverage. It works both ways, both positively and negatively. If we're going to use leverage at all, we need to be aware of what we have to do to make the growth that we plan. Because if we fall short, we can have a negative impact. So that's operating leverage. Now let's look at the other side, financial leverage. Financial leverage is what we were talking about looking at our capital structure. How much debt, how much equity. Financial leverage looks at the relationship between the changes in the operating profit we just calculated, our EBIT, compared to the percentage change in net income. So again, knowing this is a two-edged sword, if we calculate our financial leverage, we'll go back to our previous example. We have 2 million in debt, we have 1 million in equity. So our financial leverage is 2 to 1. For every change in operating profit, EBIT, we'll have twice that amount of change in net income. We have an increase in our operating profit of 15% times 2. We can predict a 30% increase in net income. And likewise on the negative side. If we have a 2% decrease in our EBIT, we'll have that 2% times our 2 to 1 leverage, a 4% decrease in net income. Both operating leverage and financial leverage, if used properly, can increase our bottom line. Operating leverage and financial leverage used incorrectly, of course, can decrease it. And when we use the term correctly, this is not judgment. This has to do with the decisions that we make and how effective they are. Do we make the right decisions to increase the revenue? Because our operating leverage, of course, was the relationship of revenue to EBIT. Then on the financial side, did we make the right decisions as far as the amount of debt financing our growth versus equity, our capital structure, so that the operating profit change drives a positive change in our net income? These two approaches, these two uses of leverage, of recognizing what leverage is, what drives it, are very important to us in planning for the future. How much leverage do we have? How much leverage do we want to have? What actions do we need to take to make sure that we drive revenue or sales, that we manage our operating costs? That's one of the reasons we have those fixed operating costs, to achieve the target operating profit. And then making sure we have the right financial leverage so that operating profit drives the amount of net income that we want. If we use leverage properly and we take the actions that we commit to achieve our revenues, operating profit, the net income will follow. Now, if we take our financial leverage and our operating leverage and combine them, what we end up with is what's called combined leverage. Combined leverage is taking literally our degree of operating leverage times our degree of financial leverage. They're multipliers to come up with what is referred to as the degree of combined leverage. So in the spreadsheet you see in front of you now, we've got quantity of 8,000 units, sales price of 100, variable cost per unit of 75. So of course our contribution margin is price of 100 minus variable cost of 75. Contribution margin is 25. Our fixed costs here are 60,000. Our operating profit, our EBIT, is 36,000. And the cost of debt is 12,000. Well, with this information in the spreadsheet we'll provide you, you'll be able to calculate your degree of operating leverage. And with these inputs we have in yellow, your degree of operating leverage is 1.43. What does that tell us? Remember, operating leverage measures the relative change in EBIT for every percentage change, increase or decrease in revenue. So from this position, how many more units, how much more revenue do we expect to have, and what will be the impact? Well, these calculations specifically tell us for every percentage increase in revenue, since the degree of operating leverage is 1.43, we'll see a 1.43 times increase in operating profit. So a 10% increase in revenue would equal a 14.3% increase in EBIT. Our degree of financial leverage we calculate as 1.5. So that says for every percentage increase in our operating profit, we'll have 1.5 times that amount of increase percentage-wise in our net income. So operating profit goes up 5%. 5% times 1.5, we can predict accurately a 7.5% increase in our net income. So when you combine 1.43% operating leverage, 1.5 in financial leverage, multiply those two, you'll come out with a degree of operating leverage of 2.14. Okay, let's make this simple. Look at an income statement. If we've calculated these degrees of leverage, if our top line, if revenue goes up by 10%, degree of operating leverage is 1.43, 1.43 times 10%, that means that our EBIT will go up 14.3%. Degree of financial leverage is 1.5. Just had an increase in our EBIT of 14.3. The relationship now between our EBIT at 14.3 and our net income is multiplied by 1.5. Well, that means that we should have an increase in our net income of about 21%, actually 21.4. That's the good news. Is there any bad news here? Of course. If our quantity, if the revenue declines by 3%, the decline in EBIT is 1.43 times that. That nets out. We multiply that times 1.5, and that'll show the decrease in net income. Or, since we've already multiplied these, take your percentage change in revenue times the 2.14, either positive or negative. That'll tell you how much your net income will increase or decrease as we have changes, increases or decreases, in our revenue. That's how we can look at leverage. That's how we can use leverage to project where we will be if we have a certain specific level of increase in revenues, operating profit. We can predict our bottom line. This is how we use leverage. It's how we use the tools today to predict where we think we will go and how. It's a very important tool in projecting forward where the organization is going so that we can make decisions that are in the best interest of the organization. If we feel, for example, that we're about to move into an economic downturn, also called a recession. If we have the opportunity, perhaps we want to reduce some of our financial leverage. We want to pay down some of our debt. Reducing our financial leverage will reduce the chance of default and reduce the impact as we look at our income statement. And that can be predicted accurately by just using this model. So, in today's module, we've talked about our various working capital components. We've talked about both an aggressive approach and a conservative approach, and taking things to an extreme to look at zero working capital. We've talked about our capital structure conceptually, long-term debt versus equity, why we might want to have more debt or less debt, and how that has an impact on our cost of capital. We looked at leverage, which of course is attempting to use fixed cost to magnify profits. We've broken that down into operating leverage, which is fixed operating assets, the left side of the balance sheet, versus financial leverage, which is our debt to equity proportions, the impact of combined leverage, and then looked at a simple Excel model that we'll provide you so you can apply this to your organization and see how your decisions will impact your future. Thanks for your participation today. Until next time, this is Daniel Feynman.